Welcome to the course Disaster Recovery and Build Back Better. My name is Ram Satish. I am an assistant professor, Department of Architecture and Planning, IIT Roorkee. Today, we are going to discuss about Build Back Better in the case of Nepal recovery. So whatever I am going to discuss with you today, it will be from the South Asian Disaster Report, which was published in 2016, and this is about the BBB, the Build Back Better, and how different case studies are able to produce different lessons, what we can take back and how we can learn from it, because every disaster experience provide us some lessons to take over for the future. So this has been published by Duryog Nivaran Secretariat, and this is about the Build Back Better concept as a theme and how it has been implemented in different disaster contexts in the South Asian region. So they have tried to cover the earthquake in Nepal in 2015 and the Miriabeda landslide in Sri Lanka in 2014, the Uttarakhand floods, Cyclone Thailin and Cyclone Hudhud from the Indian geography, which was in 2013, Cyclone Sidar and Ayla in Bangladesh in 2007 and 2011, and the monsoon floods in Pakistan in 2012 and 13. So if you look at it from 2007 to 2015, almost like we have about 7 to 8 years, we can see a variety of disasters hitting the South Asian context. And we, as a different countries, though it is a Pakistan, Sri Lanka, India, Bangladesh and as well as Nepal, we share some similarities, not only from the cultural aspect but also from our socio-economic context of it and the vulnerable context of it and the development setting of it. So instead of comparing with something what is happening in Netherlands, it is good to see in a similar geographies and the similar vulnerable context and a similar development context, how these Build Back Better approaches have been adopted and what are the challenges to build back better, and whether it is an institutional level challenge, whether it is a legal challenge, so all these things we'll be discussing about. So in today's lecture, we are going to discuss about the Nepal earthquake recovery, which has hit in the April of 2015. And as a part of this report, before this there has been some event which happened in Delhi, and School of Planning and Architecture New Delhi also have been part of this. And initially this report discusses about the jargon on similarities and dissimilarities of a Build Back Better, the notion of Build Back Better. So they try to alter a few words and they try to present how each of these terminologies refers to what. Number one, back to building better. It refers to the baseline conditions, that is a regular building practice with or without a disaster. For instance, if we don't have a building practice that focuses on the DRR or the qualities of resilience, we can scarcely hope to turn the practice around overnight after a disaster. So this is the first concept. Whereas better building back, so this talks about a sense of urgency to build back. So this is in the event of a disaster, imagine if we, on the pretext of Build Back Better, if we do it very slowly after a disaster, then on the pretext of Build Back Better, then it will also compromise the community resilience, because the slow process also will compromise the community resilience. So that is where this second concept is working. The third concept, which is talking about the Build Back Better, which is one of the important subject of our whole course. It is not just in the physical sense, that we build infrastructure, we build housing, we build the schools, we build hospitals. This is not just only in the physical sense, but in a more complete sense incorporating other social dimensions of recovery, how we can build the capacities, how we can build trust, how we can develop the belief systems, how we can develop cooperation, how we can develop the partnership, how we can enhance the social capital. So all this putting together, apart from only limiting to the physical sense, we need to embed all the social and cultural and economic aspects into it in a holistic sense. That is where we talk about the build back better. It emerged as after the 2004 tsunami, it emerged not only as a theme but also as a framework during the multinational recovery effect, because each and every nation is putting certain efforts in the disaster recovery. And the intention of this is we have to use a holistic approach towards reconstruction recovery, where the physical, social, economic conditions of a community are collectively addressed to create overall improved resilience. So it is not just only we build the housing, and we are not only building the roads, we are not only building the infrastructure, but we are also dealing with the capacities, of social, economic, and then how this whole setup will also improve resilience. So resilience to what? To cope up with the future shocks and stresses that have been imposed, not only because of the disaster, but with various other vulnerable aspects, like it could be a market issue, it could be in a political crisis, it could be a war. So how we can prepare them so that they can able to cope up with it. So this is how we call it as BBB, build back better. And in Sendai framework of action, which we already discussed about this in the earlier classes as well, there have been 16 prerequisites which has been listed under the 6 themes, because in order to improve the resilience, each and every nation has to incorporate certain action plans in order to address these 16 prerequisites, and how these are grouped into different themes. Number 1 is government. When we talk about the government aspect, it talks about adequate national scale laws, what are the regulatory mechanisms, and building codes, how to improve the building codes in order to the disaster resistant aspect of it, and the land use planning, institutions. And when we talk about codes, that is where it is addressing the uniform understanding of the uniform risk and vulnerability assessment procedures. Then the second one, we talk about the economy, and this is where we talk about the insurance and other risk sharing, public private finance for constructions, because who will provide the finance for the constructions, what stages. Like in different cases, we also have discussed in Argentina how the FORCAFE funds have been used from different organizations have put together, while the public and private partnerships are coming together, and how the needy infrastructure and support for the business resilience. Then the third aspect is the ecology, and this is where the conservation of the natural ecosystem, how important is it in order to protect the habitats from the disasters. So this is where the land use planning and measures to reverse the land degradation, how we can reverse the impacts and how we can bring back the nature. So these are all part of the concerns of this Sendai framework. Safety nets and essential services. So this can talk about the health care, HIV, maternal health, food security, nutrition, and housing. And why we are talking about the safety nets and health? Because most of these affected are the poor, which have a limited access to the medical facilities or the health infrastructure, and this is where, and also the access to shelter. So this is where we need to address that poverty aspect also into this, providing them the basic needs and essential services. And that is where we are talking about the vulnerable groups who have special needs, such as HIV, chronic diseases, or even the elderly people who are unable to cope up with their livelihoods and unable to cope up with certain stresses and shocks. So who are these vulnerable people? Human settlements, because many of the cases, like in the disasters, people migrate to different places and they try to settle down. And this is where we need to talk about the tailoring and the building and land use codes to the feasible in informal settlements. So this report, the South Asian Disaster Report, what does it aim? It aims to analyze these four aspects. One is how the Build Back Better recommendations of the Sendai framework will hold up against the institutional, resource and capacity aspects in the country's context of South Asia. The second, the capability, intent and interest of the existing mechanisms and systems of recovery and reconstruction to deliver BBB principles and recommendations upheld in the Sendai framework. So it is basically having a benchmark how the existing mechanisms are able to set forth for the BBB principles. The role of capital, development agents and other interest groups in operationalizing, so it's talking about the implementation aspect, how these different capital and the development agents and how they are able to organize themselves in deliver and operationalize the Build Back Better. Then the last one is how meaningful the BBB recommendations are in relation to prevalent institutional and policy and political interest scenarios in South Asia. So all this, they have been discussed in different cases, including Nepal, Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, Uttarakhand, Indian context, and as well as Hudhud cyclone and as well as Pakistan. So today we will discuss about the Nepal earthquake. So in April 2015, there has been a major earthquake, 7.6 Richter scale, which has hit in the Nepal. And it hit the Roorkee region, and at 11:30 it has struck the Roorkee region, and again at 12:30 it has received about 6.6 scale, and again after that it has keep receiving more than 16 times the aftershocks. So from 7.6 to almost 6.2, the intensity started reducing. So this is where the earthquake phenomenon has hit in this particular, the whole country in different parts, and aftershocks also have created many issues. The summary of the impacts is, we talk about the 8,896 lives have been lost and almost 22,000 people have been injured, and about nearly 5 lakhs private houses have been destroyed, and about 2 lakhs private houses have been damaged. Public properties like government buildings, about 2,656 have been damaged, destroyed, and as well as government buildings which has about more than 3,000 have been damaged. School buildings, institutional, they have been again destroyed, more than 19,000 have been destroyed and 11,000 have been damaged. Now if you look at the categories of earthquake affected areas, the severely hit region is about this Roorkee land, and you have the crisis hit and as well as the hit with heavy losses and the moderately hit and very slightly affected. So like that this has been zoned out, and this particular region in the Roorkee region has been affected very badly. Now we will discuss about two important phases of this whole process. One is the search, rescue and the relief phase. So the Nepal has a very good system of the disaster management procedures and the standard operating procedures. And this is where the National Emergency Operations Center and the District Emergency Operations Centers have been activated as per the standard operation procedures, which is we call it as SOP, which plays an important role. So it brings the communication between the national system and the local system at a district level. So it focuses on the disaster information communication. So from a national level to the local level, how it has to set up that communication. the management, and also how different agencies has to coordinate. That is where the stakeholder coordination. And during this process, the government have tried to adopt a kind of single door entry sort of thing, because they have to channel all the funding mechanism, they have to channel all the NGOs, they have to channel all the relief operations. So that is where a kind of one door exit options. So the government want to make sure that no victim is left out, and no one gets repeated supports, because it is very common in any relief stage, but one person, because they are always craving for certain benefits or some needs which and which they are able to get in that phase. So they want to make sure that something should be transparent, and someone already got it, they should not get again and again. So they should be a kind of uniform and very transparent in nature. And no one should not get a substandard packages. Someone has got a very better package, someone has got a very substandard package, whether in terms of the quality of the delivery or the quality of the product they have got. So we should not compromise on that. So that is where government has been advocating in this kind of channel, how everything has to streamline with this process. But in reality, there are different partner organizations which has distributed the goods and materials with different standards as per their institutional standards and decisions, while some try to follow the international standards. So obviously it cannot be a very uniform and standardized material. So each organization, whatever the resources they have and whatever the standards they have followed, and as per their agency standards or the institutional standards, and that is how they try to deliver the products. But the problem is, this particular process has not been standardized. The reason why it has not been standardized is it has not been recognized, it has not been incorporated in the legal system, legal procedures. How to standardize these relief materials, how to standardize these packages, and that is where the first and foremost important part is there is a need of standardization of relief materials in the legislations for the disaster affected communities. So each agency has worked in their own way. So this is one of the important. Then we talk about National Disaster Management Authority, we call the NDMA, which again focuses on the Preparedness Management Committee. It has subcommittees: Preparedness Management Committee, Rescue and Relief Management Committee, and Rehabilitation and Reconstruction Committee. So this is going with the time process of it. Now, in the rescue and relief management activities, they have a bill which has been as old as a dated bill of, they have an act of an existing Natural Calamity Relief Act of 1982, which has a very limited scope in establishing these procedures and also the packages of the present conditions of the post-earthquake, because it has one of the major earthquake, and there are certain situations which has not been addressed and the demand has been high. So this is where after the earthquake, this particular bill has been in the parliament in various discussions. Until now it has not been formulated as an act. So how this is very important that these lessons has to take forward in terms of policy, in terms of bills, then from formulated into acts, which further provides us a legal direction, how to do it and how to approach it, what to do it, in what way we have to procedure. It establishes the protocols and procedures. Then Nepal has very interesting aspect of how to connect the disasters and development. One is they have the LDRMP, which is called Local Disaster Risk Management Planning. So how the national level guidance has been translated into the local level guidance that is where with these planning guidelines. So this can actually connect the disasters and development, because if you go back to the literature of Frederick Honey in 1980s, where he talks about the disconnect between the disasters and the development how the disasters and development are interrelated to each other. They are part of the process. And in some cases, yes, in some councils they have this LDRMP, which is the Local Disaster Risk Management Planning Guidelines. But many of them, they are not having plan. They don't have a plan. So what to do with this? And even if there are the councils which are having, the local authorities which are having plan, and they did not receive any adequate attention in terms of how to mobilize the resources and how to build the capacities. So which means it is not adequate enough to guide the local municipalities how to enforce the local capacity, enhance the local capacities, and how to mobilize the resources, skills, labor, materials. So this has not been clearly mentioned. And similarly, there have been some observations on the Disaster Preparedness and Response Plan, which is the DPRP guidelines. And this is again after the scale of impact, because it's a major impact, 7.6 Richter scale, and having the aftershocks, and that whatever the legal documents, they were not fully adequate to be applied in practice, because the challenges are very complex in this particular scenario. And this is where one has to take these lessons and take it further to make it into a legal instruments. Now, we talk about the reconstruction and recovery of Nepal. So, first of all, it has adopted a post-disaster recovery framework, which we call it as a PDRF. So, they have certain visions. One is they have certain objectives. Now, the first thing is setting up recovery vision and strategic objectives. So, the very first and foremost part of any framework is it should have a clear vision and a strategic objective, and a clear policy which is needed for recovery and reconstruction. There is also the institutional framework for recovery and reconstruction. So, how the institutional setup and how it can actually be advocated through a management process. And this is where the implementation arrangements for recovery and reconstruction. And this is one of the foremost part is how to finance it, the financing and the financial management of it, right? In many cases after the disaster, we keep hearing a lot of discussions on how different political institutions mismanage the funds and how to deliver these funds, how to deliberate on it, and how to negotiate these things, how to bring harmony in the process. And this is where steps towards the implementation of the PDRF, the post-disaster recovery framework. So this is all the different stages, the 6 steps for implementation. And the policies, acts, and the guidelines of reconstruction overall reflect a build back better approach. They have addressed these aspects. One is building, obviously it is a safer building practice, and it has to adhere with the earthquake resistance. This is one of the prime. The second is decentralization. The decentralization and the coordination mechanisms. Then use of local resources, using the local labor, local skills, local materials. This will actually reduce a lot of financial cost, operational cost, and even it will be easy for the management procedures. This is where we talk about the self-driven reconstruction, how we can engage the people in the recovery process and the reconstruction process so that they can build their capacities. Mainstreaming DRR and mobilization of stakeholders. So, how we can mainstream the DRR into the development process and how we can mobilize the stakeholders. Then there is how we can ensure that there is a uniformity in the grant division. And we call it as GESI, addressing GESI, especially in the South Asian context. One is called gender equality and social inclusion. So this GESI, how the gender aspects and the equality aspects and the social hierarchies, how they have to be included in the development process, in the disaster and development process, is one of the important challenge in the developing countries. Avoiding social dispute and harm to local culture. So this is also the social harmony, that is what I was reflecting with. Maintaining a goodwill, scaling up and scaling out of learning from good practices during construction. So what happens is, many cases, the NGOs come forward, or some agencies or a setup will come forward, they work for 2, 3, 5 years, and then they close the whole basket. So what about these lessons in this, with the practice they have set up, how to take it forward? So this is an important mechanism we have to take, how we can scale it up. Then approved reconstruction policy, Reconstruction Act, reconstruction bylaws, or different guidelines and procedures. So that is where the NRA, the National Reconstruction Authority, it brings 4 important, because all this, whether through the policy, the act, or the reconstruction bylaws, they are talking about 4 important concerns. One is understanding the disaster risk, including the risk of climate change. One is you need to link with the climate change and DRR. That is an important component, because disaster risk is specific to a particular place, but climate change, it is a time-taking process, and it is very gradual, right? But this is not, maybe as it is not the cause, and the impact is not seen at one place, but cause is somewhere else, but the impact is also seen somewhere else. So I think in a holistically, how one can connect this whole approach is important thing. Then addressing the livelihood needs of the people during rebuilding and reconstruction. So in the recovery process, what happens to their traditional livelihoods? What happens to how we can enhance the rural livelihoods? Again, I discussed with you the gender and social inclusion in the recovery process, because how we can enhance the women leaderships, because this is what most of the deprived communities, how we have to take this as an opportunity to bring them into the front line. Decentralization and the governance, which actually how the information is passed out, how things are managed, and how things are coordinated, how things are supervised, how things are perceived. So all this very, instead of centralized approach, we need to think of the decentralized approaches. Now, this is the coordination and the institutional mechanism between the government and the national reconstruction agencies and the other stakeholders. So whereas we have the NRA central office, how it is coordinating with the sectoral ministry and the NGO central office. And here you can see that this is coming with the ministry to the department, to the district, and to the area, and to the community. So that is going in a funnel type of it. Similarly, the central office to the secretarial unit, district level, district office, area office, municipality, community based, and individual. So that is how these are linked into this aspect. Similarly, central office, district office, and the field office, so they're all going in a macro level to the micro level. And again, here we need to establish a serious contact between a macro level and how it is also reflected in the micro level. And similarly, with the National Reconstruction Agency Authority, how a central organization, you have the steering committee, the advisory council, and the appeal committee. That formulates with the executive committee, and this is how you have the chief executing officer, and which have the facilitation committee with interaction with the CEO secretariat and the experts group. And you have different thematic groups, and the secretary is the coordinating aspect. In that, they have different programs. One is the policy at planning and monitoring and development, assistance coordination division. This is talking about the heritage conservation, especially in Nepal, the Darbar Square, which has been demolished completely, how we can look at the conservation. The third aspect looks at the settlement, development, housing, and the local infrastructure like roads. And this is completely on the social mobilization, how we can mobilize the human and the resources. And this is where we talk about the public building section, heritage conservation, and physical infrastructure. And this one is looking at the housing, settlement development, and the land development and geological. So this is how this whole thing is coordinated, and then it's further branched out in various policy, information management, budget, development, legal decisions, HR management. So it's a variety of networks which is forming under a kind of tree, how it is branching out to a much more individual departments, then later on to the divisions, later on to the sectors of it. So that is how it organizational structure of NRA is. Now, some of the examples of how they are also encouraging the communities to be able to understand the irrigation rehabilitation, how they can first safeguard their crops, how they can fields, and enhance the unemployment youth and the communities with the mission training so that they can learn the skills and they can be part of the self-help housing process. Sanitation awareness to women health workers, because sanitation is one of the very important issue in the developing countries, and especially for gender. The women, they don't have toilets, and because of there could be some religious reasons, there could be some social reasons to it associated to it, but how we have to sensitize them and how we have to make them aware that they have to be adopting the sanitary procedures, how they have to follow, how they have to give the importance. Then for elderly people, there's a kind of tea shelter, how they can also, but if you look at that, there's a kind of temporary shed, the tin sheets, the galvanized sheets, they have kept it. So this is the kind of schemes which they have developed. Now, first of all, neither funding or the human resource requirements are not adequate to meet these needs, because the needs are very vast. One is addressing the complexity of the DRR, the climate change, and the gender equality and social inclusion. That becomes one of the important challenge, because we need to mainstream these needs into the sectorial development process and programs. So from a very holistic understanding, we need to develop as a program in a sectorial development. We have so many tools, but there is no standard approach or a methodology applied. So this is one of the important drawback. Despite of having tools, why we are not able to get a kind of standard approach. A well-structured monitoring plan for the NRA is also needed at different levels, because though we have a different organized structure, we need to think about the monitoring plan and which can address the bottom level realities to it. I think this has given you a very brief understanding of what happened in the Nepal and how this Build Back Better has been adopted both from the governance point of it and from the setup of it, and by the legal instructions, how they were not adequate to fulfill. So what are the challenges they are facing? So this has given you a little overview on the challenges of Build Back Better. Thank you very much.